Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Murray Levin, and I'm really pleased and thrilled to welcome you to the inaugural address in our 7-part lecture series on Orson Welles and the Golden Age of Hollywood. In the coming months, we're going to be presenting to you a series of critics and commentators and cultural historians that are going to fill us in on the life and times of Orson Welles. And I think I can promise you that it'll be a real intellectual adventure. Many of us associate Orson Welles with the great cultural capitals of the world: Hollywood, New York, London, Paris. But actually, George Orson Welles was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin in 1915. His father was something of an inventor, and his mother was one of the first women ever elected to public office in the Middle West. It didn't take the mom and pop too long to get the idea that their son really was something special. He could do anything. He was a genius. And sure enough, sooner or later, Orson came to think the same himself. Tonight's program is entitled Mr. Lucky, the life of Orson Welles before he went to Hollywood. Both the man and his achievements are so spectacular and overwhelming that it really takes a historian to put it all together for us. So we have turned to one of our nation's foremost biographers and historians, David Nasaw. Many of you may well remember David from the outstanding lecture that he gave in our earlier series on Senator Joseph McCarthy, or you may recognize him from his many appearances on TV, on the History Channel, or in the PBS series, The American Experience. His writings and commentary have appeared in numerous places, including the New York Times, Slate Magazine, the Wall Street Journal. And of course, he is probably best known as the author of major biographies of Andrew Carnegie and William Randolph Hearst and Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch. It's interesting to note that Hearst is thought by many to have been the model for Citizen Kane, and he spared no expense trying to destroy both the man and the film. And though it's little known, Joseph P. Kennedy, for quite a while, was engaged in trying to finance, and he aspired to take over leading Hollywood film studios, which later became RKO. After David's address, it's your time. So we're going to turn to the audience, and I hope you'll be thinking during David's remarks of your questions. I'll ask you to stand and wait for one of our volunteers to come over to you with a mic, and we'll go from there. So at this time, it's really a pleasure, and I would say an honor, to bring you our first featured guest, David Nasaw.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Dick Levinson for coming up with the brilliant idea of doing a 7-part series on Orson Welles and inviting me so I could reacquaint myself with this. You know, you can never find the right adjective. I can spend the next hour going through adjectives that have been applied to this man. You can't make it up. You can't make this life up. And if you did, as a novel, no one would believe you. He was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, moved with his mother, father, and older brother to Chicago when he was 3. He's a Midwestern boy and a Chicago boy. His mother was a musical prodigy, a talented pianist, an activist for women's suffrage, and the first elected official in the Kenosha, for the Kenosha School Board. You couldn't run for any other office. His father was a talented inventor, businessman, and a very, very rich man. He would today be accounted a millionaire. His brother was 10 years older than Orson was, eccentric, probably mentally ill in some way, a failure in school and everything he touched. There was Mommy, there was Daddy, and then there was Dada. Dr. Maurice Bernstein, one of the strangest individuals I've ever come up with. He was part of the family. He was a confidant of both parents. He was a man probably in love with Orson's mother, who after Orson's mother died, became best friends with Orson's father. And he was a second father and the guardian for Orson Welles. Orson's birth mother and father split up when he was not yet 4, but it didn't matter much to him because he now had 3 households: Dada's, Mommy's, and Daddy's. And in each of them, he had parents who spoiled him rotten, loved him, gave him whatever he wanted. He was the golden child. If his older brother was a failure and a mess, Orson had everything. And he was doted on. And he was given everything he needed to become a genius. Most important of all, astounding self-confidence that comes when both parents, but especially your mother, tells you over and over and over again that you are a genius, a wonder, a prodigy. He recalled later that as a child he never heard a discouraging word, that there was no limit to what he could do or what he was told he would do. Quote, "The word genius was whispered into my ear, the first thing I ever heard, while I was still mewling in my crib," he told one of his biographers. So it never occurred to me that I wasn't a genius until middle age. Now, one of the problems in writing about Orson Welles was he was one of the world's first and greatest talk show guests. Everybody loved him. And if you go on YouTube, when you get home or tomorrow morning, look at the Dick Cavett interviews or the Merv Griffin interviews or the Johnny Carson interviews or the Frost interviews. He was amazing. He loved to be interviewed, although he always disdained the process. And he made a lot of it up. Not only did he make it up, but he hung out with theater people and writers, and they made it up. So it is very, very difficult to get the story straight. I'll try my best, as his biographers have. At age 9, his mother died. He abandoned music and claimed never to have sat down at a piano again. He also claimed that he was a prodigy at the piano and would have had a brilliant career, though there's no evidence of that at all. He was left, however, with 2 rich fathers, soon to be 3. He adopted a 3rd father, whose name was Roger Hill, who was the headmaster at the Todd School that he attended. He was nicknamed Skipper. So there was Daddy, Dada, and Skipper. They all assured him, as his mother had, that he was a genius. And whatever he wanted, they bought. Magic kits, makeup kits, face paints, wigs, books. He had a thing for makeup from the time he was 10 years old. He would be criticized later for for always over making himself up, where an actor would smoothly put on a mask. He would just slap it on like mud and go on stage with it. With his 3 fathers, sometimes 2 at a time, sometimes 1 at a time, rarely 3 at a time, he traveled. He went to the theater and concerts in Chicago and Ravinia Park, where there was a music festival. He met the stars of opera and stage. He hobnobbed with Chicago's literary elite, and everywhere he went, he was admired, respected, doted over as a boy genius. You know, he was an orphan, but seldom as an orphan had lost a mother and had 3 parents left who doted over him. He missed his mother. He loved his mother. But the 3 fathers did all they could. He went to public school, first in Madison, Wisconsin, and he made a larger-than-life impression, as he always did. He was interviewed and photographed for the first time for a newspaper article, a feature article, in Madison, Wisconsin's Capital Times in February 1926. The headline read, "Cartoonist, actor, poet, and only 10." He ended up, and we don't know why, he said because the man he was living with, the teacher at this school, came on to him. He spent, one of the stories he loved was to tell about all the men who fell in love with him and the difficult situations he was put into. It began when he was 10, and he claimed the man who he was living with, the head of the public school, made advances that were rebuffed. He came home, and Dada found a place for him at the Todd School, an amazing school, amazing private school in Woodstock, Illinois, not far from Chicago, which was the perfect place for him. It was a wonderland. There was math. He didn't do very well at that. There was a little bit of history. Didn't do very well at that. There may have been sciences, though he never talked about them. But there was drama. There was theater. There was a playhouse. And that's just what he needed. He was a talkative. When he arrived, he was not yet a teenager. He was talkative, chubby-cheeked, fabulously unathletic. But he never stopped performing, showing off, doing magic tricks, reciting Shakespeare and his own poetry, bouncy, energetic, unstoppable. His first roommate asked to be moved. He loved Orson because Orson would every night come out of the closet in some costume and recite to him. At Todd, and again, he's 12 years old, then 13, he adapts theater pieces, produces them, directs them, does the stage and costume design, and of course, the makeup. He took over the school's drama department and was running it by the time, when he was a high school sophomore. And then miraculously, in the second or third year of his time at Todd, the miracle of puberty took place. And this chubby, funny-looking little boy was transformed like that into a tall, handsome youth with unruly, untamed black hair, a winning smile, a boisterous, infectious laugh, and a booming, glorious, musical voice. And we will come back to that again and again, that voice. The Todd School became his true home. His father was by this time heavily into booze. He was a drunkard. He was still a very rich man. He tried to open a hotel and opened it, but it burned down soon after he opened it. His drinking and heart problems were too much for his birth father, who died before Orson was 16, just as he was ready to graduate from Todd. Todd only went up to the 10th grade, and then you graduated. Dada, Maurice Bernstein, was named his guardian by a Chicago judge. Orson wasn't terribly happy with that. He would have preferred Skipper, his adopted father at the Todd School, to be his guardian. His father left him a fortune in stocks. This is before the Depression. Dr. Bernstein became his guardian and the executor of his will, of his father's will. And Dr. Bernstein immediately moved into a huge mansion of a house, which he claimed he did to give Orson space to grow up in. And throughout his life, Orson never quite knew how much money had been left him. It was doled out. Part of the problem, which the biographers can't quite figure out, and Orson couldn't either, was what happened to those stocks after 1929, because most of the money his father left was in stocks. Dada pushed for his young charge to go to school. Orson later claimed he was accepted at Harvard. There's no evidence of that. It would have been nice because he would have been Joseph Kennedy Jr.'s classmate. So I would have loved to spend more time on this story, but I don't think he was ever accepted at Harvard. He kept getting pushed to go to school by Dada. If not Harvard, Cornell, someplace else. Orson didn't want to go to school. He was a terrible student, was too restless to sit in the classroom, wanted to be the focus of attention, not listen to, he wanted to talk, not listen to somebody else talk. So what did he do? He manipulated Dada, his guardian, and said, look, before I go back to school, I want to go on a trip. I'll use my inheritance money. I'm going to go to Scotland and Ireland on a painting tour because I think I might want to be a painter. And he goes. I mean, again, it's hard to believe, but I've seen photos. He rents a donkey cart and a donkey and tours through Ireland, has a great time, meets all sorts of interesting people, charms them till they invite him into the house, probably has one of his first sexual experiences in a family that had saw fit to invite him to stay a while. He tells Dada that he's going to, at the end of his trip, apply to Trinity College in Dublin, which of course he doesn't do. He's on a tight allowance because Dada, we don't know why. Dada may have been using the money himself. He probably didn't trust Orson. He arrives in Dublin, spends a long time trying to find the American Express office because he thinks there's going to be money waiting for him. He finally finds the office, but there's no money there. So what does he do? He's not at all disappointed because now he has to get a job, and where's he going to get a job? In the theater. There's a new theater that's been formed by two actor managers whose names I can't pronounce, and I'm not even going to try to do it. He goes for an audition. He claims he was a Broadway star. And instead of being 16, was 18 or 19. Nobody believed him. In his audition, he overacts, exaggerated, is a frightening ham of a man. But with that extraordinary voice and a total lack of restraint, he gets the second lead part in a play called Jew Sus, Swiss Jew. He gets the part of, not the Jew, but of the Duke, who is in debt to the Jew. On stage, again, he has no technique. He's overacts. He has no restraint. He's much too physical. But there's a magic there. And there's a magic there that even his detractors are entranced by, and the critics are entranced by. They can't quite believe it. Simon Callow, himself an actor, says of Welles, he was by temperament emotional, intuitive, and impulsive, sexually compulsive, a dreamer, a poet, and glorious company, funny, fantastical, eloquent, and inescapably exotic. As an actor, he was equipped with a slight, graceful physique, a viola voice darkened by 60 cigarettes a day, and a distinct charisma. He was also prone, on stage, to self-hypnosis, bewitched by his own cadences, and to a certain overemphasis of his profile. He loved to stand in profile. He had a little nose. It wasn't one of his best features, a little pug nose. There was vanity there, says Callow, but also a spell-binding mystery that was his soul's natural element. Later, in those dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews, he says this was his first triumph, his greatest triumph at age 16, and his career went downhill from there. He would later say the same thing about directing Macbeth with an all-black cast and about Julius Caesar. He was a star in Dublin, but where do you go from there? He was untrained, 16 years old. He comes back to the United States and is somewhat lost. He wants to go into the theater, but nobody quite wants him. He tries to audition. He sends notes. He puts a notice in Variety, that he can do anything. He travels some more. He stays with friends. He writes, his own theater pieces, full-length scripts. He writes a book about performing Shakespeare with Skipper, from Todd. And then he meets Thornton Wilder, another Midwesterner in Chicago. And Wilder says, "What are you doing, young man?" And he charms Wilder. And Wilder says, "Let me see what I can do for you, young man." And Wilder gets in touch with everybody he knows on Broadway and in New York. And Orson is hired to join the company of Katharine Cornell, the biggest stage star in the world at that time. I mean, America's Bernhardt. And he's hired to play Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet, a role that calls for overacting, for exuberance, for jumping around. And again, he's a sensation. When they get to Broadway, he's told that you were a good Mercutio, but we need Brian O'Hearn. Everybody ever hear of him? We need Brian O'Hearn because we're in repertory and we want him to play in the other two roles, and he'll only join the company if he plays Mercutio. So he's demoted to Tybalt, but again is phenomenal. And while performing as Tybalt, a slightly older man, 10 years old, named Joseph Hausman, is so taken with this performance, and it's a minor performance. I mean, it's not a huge role, that he gets in touch with Welles and he says, "Let's form our own company together. Let's work together." Welles is 20, can't vote yet. Hausman's 30. They begin to work together. But by now, it's the Depression. Theaters are closing, audiences are dwindling, no new plays are being produced, and the two young men are, can't make a living. Welles is married by now, ambitious as ever, and he's saved by his voice. By his voice. He's hired for the American School of the Air on radio. And he's 20, and he voices dozens of different characters. Joes in the street, young girls, ladies, babies, children, famous men, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and he's a marvel. He is in great demand as a radio performer, at first anonymous. Nobody knows who he is. except the producers and the directors. They know that voice, and they know this guy can pick up a script, and without rehearsal, read it brilliantly. He takes every job he's offered because he has no other way to make a living. And for the first time in his life is making money and enjoying himself doing it. As he later told Dick Cavett, there's no better place to do drama than radio. Why? Because on radio, the audience has to pay attention. You gotta listen. You can't lose your attention. And every radio actor knew that. He and Houseman still want to work together. And Welles has figured out what he wants to do with his life. He wants to become not just an actor, but an actor-manager, an actor-director, like the great 19th century actor-managers with his own company, touring. He will direct, he will act, he will choose the plays. But they got no money, he and Houseman. Lots of brains, no money. It's the Depression. And one of the few men who makes out during the Depression, and his biographers have called this luck, fate, destiny. The Federal Theater Project comes along. A New Deal program that is going to throw money into the theater because the unemployment of actors and stagehands and theater people is greater than, manufacturers of steel or people who work on the railroads or in factories. And as part of the Federal Theater Project, they are going to about 8 or 9 different units all across the country. And one of those is going to be a black theater company in Harlem that is going to produce plays with black actors for a black audience, because the unemployment in Harlem is greater than anywhere else, as are Democratic votes. Roosevelt always knows where his votes are. Miraculously, Joe Houseman, who is white, as he's an Eastern European, is chosen to lead the Black Theater Company. And there were protests in the beginning, but Houseman had always gotten along with the black community, with the Harlem community. He was respected. He had done some work with black actors. And he says, I'm only going to do it if Welles comes along with me. Welles joins him. And the first thing they do with federal money, right, is the so-called Voodoo Macbeth. It's, astonishing. Shakespeare has been all through the 19th century. All through the 19th century, Americans had done whatever the hell they wanted with Shakespeare. There had been frontier Shakespeare, cowboy Shakespeares, you could make it up as you went along. Call it Hamlet and put them anywhere you want. Nobody paid any attention to the script because nobody knew what the real script was. So Welles still can't vote, not old enough, but he adapts the play, casts it, designs the costumes, the stage sets, directs it, produces it, can't star in it, except once when the understudy can't do it, he puts on blackface and plays the part. Macbeth opens on his 21st birthday, sells out its run, goes to Broadway, then on tour. It is a sensation. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. There were some racist comments on, we didn't know that black people could, speak Shakespeare. But aside, when you cut away that racist undercurrent, the critics are just wild over it, and the audiences are even more wild. It fills the Harlem stage. And people from uptown, John Barrymore comes to see it. It's a sensation as drama, as spectacle, and as an early attack on segregation. It's one of the first shows, before Nat King Cole and Harry Belafonte, that refuses to play in cities or theaters with segregated seating. Again, Wells says that Macbeth was the highlight of his career, and everything was downhill from there. Wells and Houseman, after their great success, figure out that they're not going to do it again. And, let African-American actors and directors and writers take over. But they're no dopes, these guys. They know the only money in the Depression for theater is going to come from the federal government. So they go to the Federal Theater Project and they say, we want to start a new unit. We want to start a unit that produces only classical theater, only classics, and we'll do it, for audiences, and we won't charge a lot of money. And the Federal Theater Project, which is in trouble because there are too many communists and there's two left, says, great, how can we lose with classic theater? And again, Wells and Houseman succeed. They are brilliant at working the press, at publicity, at getting an audience. Their biggest hit is a fascist-themed Julius Caesar, where everyone is dressed in black, and Julius Caesar is very much Mussolini. The stage and costumes are designed by Wells, it's cast by Wells, special lighting and sound effects by Wells, directed by Wells, adapted, written, rewritten, written, and rewritten again. And he plays Brutus besides. Again, a wild success. He's 22 years old, but he's not making any money. So what does he do? He continues his radio career. And he gets this extraordinary assignment to play Lamont Cranston. Who knows who Lamont Cranston is? The Shadow. He is the Shadow, okay? And he's brilliant at it, and he makes lots and lots of money, and he throws his money into the Mercury Theater, which is Houseman in his later production, as he had thrown his, and he's the first. Roosevelt later says to him, you're the only man I know who put private money into a public theater. He is billed on Radioland as a quadruple threat. CBS, after he's been a success, gives him his own show, which is called the Mercury Theater of the Air. And they bill it as produced, directed, written, and acted in by the quadruple threat creator. On May 6th, his 23rd birthday, he's celebrated on Time magazine as the marvelous boy. George Orson Welles, Shadow to Shakespeare, Shoemaker, one of his plays, to Shaw. The sky is the only limit his ambitions recognize. The Mercury Theater produces classic after classic. They do radio versions of Julius Caesar, Jane Eyre, Dickens, Booth Tarkington stories, Jules Verne's Around the World. For Halloween, he decides what better than, another Wells, H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds. And they do so spectacularly. It was an adaptation, and the radio listing said the same thing. The Mercury Theater presents Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater in H.G. Wells. But lots of people tuned in late. And why'd they tune in late? Because the CBS program was the second-rated program. Everybody listened in the beginning to Charlie McCarthy. okay? And they listened to Charlie McCarthy in the opening monologue for 8 to 9 minutes. And then they went back to Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater. And those people who had missed the beginning tune in just as the announcement comes that Martians have been sighted in Grover Plains. The police are on the way. We don't know how many there are or how many injuries there would be. It gets worse from there. The network tries to stop the show. They don't know what's going on. Hausman refuses to let them. A half an hour later, Wells comes out, learns what has happened, is ashen. The next morning, he gives a press conference. And it's the only time where you see him near speechless. He looks exhausted, unshaven. He's sort of shaking. He says, I had no idea. How could people mistake this? He said, would people really believe they were Martians? He said, this is H.G. Wells. And it was the best thing. First, he thinks he's going to be arrested or he's going to lose his show. And then he realizes, boom, this is the best thing that's ever happened to him. At 24 years of age, his radio show was a success. His theater career at an end with 2 gigantic flops in a row. And nothing in the works. RKO comes calling. And they offer him an extraordinary contract to the boy genius. Never before had there been a contract. He got some money, good money, but he got almost total creative control. The only man in Hollywood besides Charlie Chaplin ever to get it, right? And he's 24 years old. Hollywood hates him. Every producer, every director, every studio, they can't believe it. He was ready to go when no one else had gone. In the theater as he had in the movies as he had on the stage and in radio. He would be the master of his art. On July 17th, he departs for the West Coast, leaving his wife and the theater behind, but he still needs to make money. His radio program is now sponsored by Campbell's Soup. They give him a lot of money, and he reads the commercials. He flies back to New York every Sunday to do his radio show. Okay, that's the essential story. Let me just say a couple of things as a historian, okay? Luck, every biographer talks about destiny, fate, luck when they talk about him. But historians don't believe in destiny, fate, or luck. We believe in context and in providing context. The only way to understand an individual, man or woman or child, prodigy or failure, is to place him or her in the world that he or she is born into, grows up in, and prospers or fails in. No individual is an island who makes his own luck, who is born a genius and boom, is a success. A little context, okay? A little context, and I'll be quick. Orson Welles lives through the 1920s, a boom period, a period of confidence. If he had been born earlier or later, his father never would have been a millionaire. He never would have lived in a boom period where the nation was as optimistic as he was and as ambitious. In the 1920s, period of his youth, right? Up to age 15, the number of telephones in the nation doubles. The number of miles Americans drive in their motor cars quadruple. The number of homes that were electrified explodes, especially in Chicago, in the suburbs, in the city. Middling families could now afford electric irons and other household appliances. He identifies himself as a Midwesterner, but Kenosha was not a hick town. Kenosha was a very successful factory town, and Chicago was booming through the 20s. The 20s were a glorious time for the theater. And you could see why his ambitions were set on the theater, because he grows up in the 20s. And his father is a rich man who can support him. And then, boom, at age 15 comes the Depression. And to understand Welles, we've got to take into account not only his boyhood in the Roaring '20s, but his teenage and young adult years in the Depression. The theater, which had boomed in the 20s, dies in the 30s. And it is only a New Deal program and federal money which makes it possible for him to succeed. Without that federal money and the Federal Theater Project, Welles would have been lost to the theater, and his dreams would never have come true, and there would have been no fate, no destiny, no luck. And let me make one other point. Welles comes of age with radio. If he had been born 10 years earlier or 10 years later, he never would have made his reputation, his career, and his money. In 1922, when he was 7 years of age, there were 100,000 radio sets produced in the country, and there were 30 radio stations. By 1930, when he was 15, that 100,000 radio sets had become 4 million. Those 30 stations had in 8 years become 618. And by the year of War of the Worlds, more than 7 million new sets were being produced annually. There were 29 million families in the United States. 27 million families had at least one radio set and listened to it an average of 3 to 4 hours every day. So it's not enough to talk about luck and genius and destiny and fate. And let me mention one other thing. If Welles had been born and raised in France or Germany or the Soviet Union or England, there would have been a national theater. There would have been a national theater which supported him. Okay? But he was raised in the United States during the Depression. There was no national theater, there was no money, and so he ended up in Hollywood. And I thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
I've got some questions. I think we can agree that more than a little of the excitement and genius of Orson Welles has rubbed off on our speaker tonight. Let's give him another hand. All right, let me pose one quick question, and then we'll see what is going on in the minds of our audience. You mentioned Houseman, who was his partner in the Mercury Theater and otherwise. Could you lead us through some of the rest of what happened in their relationship? Some of the people in the audience may recognize Houseman as the winner of the Academy Award for Best Actor sometime in the 70s. So what can you tell us about Houseman and how his relationship with Welles prospered or did not in later years?
The only person Welles, is this mic on? Yeah. The only person Welles got along with through his whole life was Joseph Cotten, who he loved. Joseph Cotten was the opposite in every way of Welles. And Cotten and Welles got together and they did all sorts of stuff together. Houseman and Welles fought like tooth and nails, like dogs and cats, for their entire career together. And yet, they needed one another. Welles was one of the world's worst businessmen. He never knew how to balance a budget. He always spent much more than he brought in. He was always in debt. And Houseman was a businessman. He He knew how to rent a theater. He knew how to outfit a theater. He knew how to get a show on time, onto the air, on the radio. And Welles, though he talked down at him, though they had split up as a team on numerous occasions, when he signed his RKO deal, made a condition of that deal that he bring Houseman out to work with him.
Okay. Let's see those hands.
John Houseman different than Joseph Houseman, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, not the paper chase John.
No, this
Okay.
is Joe Houseman,
Thank
the
you.
director.
Thank you. Let's see those hands. Right over here.
Could you speak a little bit more about the role of his wife, and did he ever have any children?
Yeah, he married a beautiful young woman who was sort of an intern apprentice at a summer theater he ran at the Todd School, sort of between gigs. Virginia, and they loved each other, apparently. They had one child who, you know, the person I thought was the strangest in naming children was Musk. Take a look at the names of Musk's children. Well, Orson named his daughter Christopher. And she asked him on numerous occasions, "Why did you name me Christopher?" And he said, "Well, it's a beautiful name." And the daughter said, "Yes, but it's not a girl's name." And he said, "Well, it is now. You're the first." He had, the relationship broke up because he was absolutely insufferable. Nobody could live with him for long. He was gallivanting all over the place. They moved to try to have a family relationship after his child was born to Sneeden's Landing, which is in 30 minutes out of New York City. But he had to come into New York every day for a shave and a fancy lunch and a rehearsal. And then he would work all day and work all night and have a number of affairs in between. And no one could live with that. He had several other relationships with actresses, Geraldine Fitzgerald. He married Rita Hayworth. But nobody could live with this man for long.
Thank you so much for the fabulous, exciting, dynamic presentation. I want to ask, speaking of names, when did he stop using George and become Orson? And this is something that we see this in so many people, that they'll change their first name to an initial and go by their middle name. So I wonder, are there legends or stories about that?
He never used George. Never. As a matter of fact, most people didn't even know there was such a person. I didn't until I read my third biography. Orson there were two Orsons in his life. I think one was a relative, the other had been in the theater, and he flattered both of them by saying, "I was named after you," and I'm so happy it happened that way.
I just used George to tweak you at the beginning. There you go.
Yeah, so you described Welles as someone with a seemingly invincible confidence in himself. But being somebody who lost both of his parents at a fairly young age, is there any context you can give as to how losing his parents may have affected his confidence in how he viewed himself or how he viewed the world around him?
It's a great question. And the biographers have wrestled with, he's probably has as many biographers, as close to Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. They're just all over the place. And they wrestle with that question all the time. One of the things that he could never finish anything. And his last two shows on Broadway were total disasters because he never finished the script. And actors had to rehearse on scripts that were only half written. He was all over the place. He was frighteningly restless. He was always looking for something new. And some biographers have thought that was because he didn't have the stability of a family house, of a family home. And he didn't have a mother or a father who said, sit down and do your homework and finish it before you go out onto something else.
Any questions in the back? Yes. Here, come. Can you help her with the microphone?
Was there any indication that he suffered from mania?
You know, there are some biographers have identified, and some of his closer associates identified a problem, and his brother was institutionalized. But I don't think so. I mean, he was, the mania was that of someone who had no limits, no limits. He could work. He didn't have ADA because he could sit and he could work for 24 hours on a script. But he was frighteningly restless. And if I had been at RKO, I never in a million years would have given him that contract. And for his entire life, he finished Citizen Kane. But the number of projects that were never finished because he was too restless, because he moved on to something else, because he underwrote the script, because he didn't rehearse. I mean, it's frightening. In one of the interviews, I think it's with Frost, with David Frost, he says, I never should have left the theater. He said, I spent too much of my life chasing money and trying to convince investors that I would finish a project and that they would get back their money. He said, in large parts, it was a wasted life. I mean, in the lectures to come, you will see a man with astounding highs and lows in his career and in his life. And you'll also see a man who lived life beyond the boundaries of sanity and health. He drank too much. He slept too little. He traveled too much. He worked himself to death, to close to death, to collapse on any number of occasions. And he made promises he could not keep. Every one of his projects was too big, was unfilmable. And he had to fight to get something, on celluloid. And failed as much as he succeeded.
Yes, sir, right here.
Thank you. Yes, you described him as being, I think, insufferable. So did he have any friends throughout his life that actually stuck with him? Or were people just glomming onto him because they saw a meal ticket in the making?
Yeah, he had friends. Joseph Cotton was the main one. But he quickly wore out those friendships. His closest friendships were ephemeral. And he was a great guy to have at a dinner party, a great guy to spend an evening with. But he wore you out. He wore you out. And he was inconstant as a friend. And he badmouthed too many of the people he worked with. He just couldn't help himself. When he did Voodoo Macbeth, he at one point told Bosley Crowther of the New York Times, well, it's really hard teaching these people to speak English in a correct way. I mean, my God, these are the people you're working with. And he was impossible to work with, he was impossible to live with, but he was a lot of fun to spend an evening with.
Thank you. 3 quick questions, and thank you for your talk, incidentally. The first radio broadcasting company that he worked for, that's one question. Second question, what year was Voodoo Macbeth produced? And the third, who ran RKO when he got that deal?
Yeah, George Schaefer ran RKO. George Schaefer was a businessman whose major office was in New York. Voodoo Macbeth is, I should have it in my notes. Voodoo Macbeth is very early. I think he's 20 years old when he does Voodoo Macbeth, which would have been 35 or 36. What was the third question?
The original radio, the original...
CBS.
But I'm talking about the first, when he was doing the voiceovers and everything else.
Oh, he worked for everybody.
Oh, okay.
He worked for every station. Look, one of the things that radio was doing, radio was brand new, and radio had so much crap on it. I mean, it was indefensible. So he was brought in when they realized he could write and act, had a great voice, and could bring in cast members. Mercury Theater was brought in to lift the profile. It was, he was never, he never rivaled the Charlie McCarthy show or Bing Crosby or any of the other early stars. But he made a big reputation and a lot of money.
Let's hear from someone in the back. Don't be bashful. Okay, over on the left there.
Fascinating presentation about a fascinating person. Thank you. I've a question about luck. Sometimes luck's defined as when opportunity meets preparation. Wells must have worked at his craft. Did you find anything in your research of what his work I'm always fascinated by authors and artists and how their work schedule, how they apply themselves, say, on a daily basis or a weekly basis in terms of creating the craft. So when the opportunity comes, they're prepared for it.
He worked at writing. He was an extraordinary writer. If anybody's ever read any of his letters, they're just, his prose style is magnificent. So he worked early, and he would work all night when he was adapting something, when he was writing something. But as an actor, no preparation, and he was faulted for it. As a director, when he showed up for rehearsals, he would work people hard. But you got to remember, at the same time that he's doing the theater, he's doing the radio. So a lot of rehearsals don't start until midnight or 10 o'clock and go through the morning. And then he would go into the dressing room and write. So his work ethic was, shall we say, mixed. He took on so much that he couldn't apply himself to anything except early in his career, the writing of stage plays that never made it.
Okay, we have time for two more. Two more, back there.
Has anybody ever attempted to finish any of his plays?
Yes. Yes. Lots of people have attempted, and recently, the drama department at one of the California schools, maybe Santa Barbara, tried to put on Voodoo Macbeth. And others have tried, and there may be in a later lecture some discussion of the attempts to complete his work. He always complained. He always complained. The greatest complaint was the Magnificent Ambersons, which he said was absolutely destroyed by having scenes cut out of it, and was later rewritten by, was it Losi? Weiler? I'm looking for help over here. It was later rewritten because when it was shown in previews, and Hollywood loves previews, the audience walked out because it was too long. Welles didn't care. Wells didn't care. He wanted those 30 minutes put back. But he was in Brazil at the time, and RKO just cut what it wanted. There have been attempts to try to find scenes that were cut and put them back in some of his films. Few have succeeded.
Last question.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dick Levinson. I'd just like to quickly take advantage of the producer's prerogative to say that we're in the process of telling you a fascinating story with 7 chapters. So if you like what you've heard and seen tonight, I'd like to invite you to return on Wednesday, May 17th for the 2nd chapter in the Orson Welles story, when we will be looking at Hollywood as Orson Welles first discovered it. Please come and bring your friends.
Okay, so I can't top that ending. Thank you again for coming, and thank you, David, for a great evening.